Let me be upfront with you about something before this video even starts. The phrase dual booting Linux and Windows has scared people away from trying Linux for years. And honestly, a lot of that fear is earned because historically, the process involved partitions disappearing, bootloaders getting overwritten by Windows updates, and spending a Saturday afternoon staring at a black screen wondering what you broke. I have been through that experience on older distributions, and it is not fun. But the reason I am making this specific video about CachyOS is because something has genuinely changed. The install experience in 2026, particularly with the reworked installer that shipped in the January 2026 release, is not the same beast it used to be. And if you are the kind of person who games on Windows but has been watching the Linux gaming space grow and wondering whether you could run both on the same machine without giving up your existing setup, this video is exactly for you. We are going to walk through the entire process from why you would even want CachyOS specifically, through every step of the actual installation, through the bootloader decisions that trip most people up, and through what your life actually looks like after you reboot into a working dual boot system. Let us start with the obvious question. Why CachyOS specifically, and not one of the other Linux distributions that are perfectly fine for gaming? The honest answer is that CachyOS occupies a specific and well-defined niche. It is built on Arch Linux as its foundation, which means you get access to the Arch user repository, one of the largest collections of user-maintained software packages in the Linux world. It also means you are running a rolling release distribution, which in practice means your software stays current without you needing to do a fresh reinstall every year the way Ubuntu users do when a new LTS version drops. But unlike vanilla Arch, which famously requires you to install everything manually from a command prompt with no graphical assist, CachyOS gives you a proper installer and a configured system out of the box. The Arch power without the Arch hazing ritual, basically. The part that makes CachyOS interesting beyond just being a friendlier Arch is what the project does at the compiler level. All packages in CachyOS are compiled with link time optimization and a technique called bolt optimization. And they are built targeting modern CPU instruction sets, rather than the conservative baseline that most mainstream distributions use. What this means, practically, is that your CPU is doing work more efficiently because the code was compiled specifically to take advantage of features your processor actually has. Real-world benchmarks in early 2026 showed CachyOS outperforming vanilla Arch by somewhere between 8 and 12% in 99th percentile frame times, under DirectX 12 titles running through Proton. That is the kind of margin that shows up most noticeably in CPU-heavy games and in high refresh rate scenarios where consistency matters as much as average frame rate. The kernel scheduler patches that ship with CachyOS also specifically target micro stutters, which are those brief but irritating frame time spikes that do not show up in average FPS numbers, but absolutely show up in how a game actually feels when you're playing it. The CachyOS project also maintains its own fork of Proton, Valve's compatibility layer for running Windows games on Linux, called Proton CachyOS. In 2026, this fork added support for FSR4 machine learning frame generation on RDNA 4 and RDNA 3 graphics cards. If you are running a Radeon RX 7000 or RX 9000 series card, that is a directly relevant feature. Proton CachyOS is available alongside the standard Proton versions, so you can use it where it helps and fall back to upstream Proton when needed. Now, there is a real trade-off to be honest about before we go any further. CachyOS running a rolling release cycle means updates come continuously rather than in large versioned releases. This is generally a good thing because you always have recent software. But it does mean that if you update aggressively and something in the package chain has an issue, you might run into problems that a more conservative distribution would have caught before pushing to users. CachyOS has built-in safety nets for this, particularly through its snapshot system, which we will talk about. But the risk is real and worth knowing before you commit. This is not Ubuntu. You're expected to be reasonably comfortable with the system you are running. With that context established, let us talk about what you actually need before you touch anything. The requirements are straightforward. You need your existing Windows 11 machine, and you need to know that Windows is already installed and working correctly before you start, because the correct order is always Windows first, then Linux. If you install Linux first and then Windows on top of it, Windows will overwrite the bootloader, and you will spend time fixing that. Windows does not acknowledge that other operating systems exist during its own installation process, so always have Windows already in place. You need a USB drive that is at least 8 gigabytes. The CachyOS ISO is large enough that a 4 gigabyte drive will not be sufficient. 8 gigabytes is the minimum, and 16 is more comfortable if you have one sitting around. You need at least 30 gigabytes of free space on your drive to give to CachyOS. 30 is genuinely a bare minimum, and you will feel the squeeze if you try to use the system seriously with that little space. If you can carve out 60 to 100 gigabytes, you will be in a much more comfortable position. CachyOS on the drive itself is not huge, but the packages you install over time, game files you might want to store on the Linux side, and general breathing room add up fast. You need an active internet connection during installation. This is not optional. CachyOS's installer downloads the desktop environment during installation rather than bundling it on the ISO, which is part of why the ISO is a manageable size, but it also means offline installation simply does not work. Make sure your Ethernet is plugged in or that you know your Wi-Fi password before you start. You also need to back up anything on your Windows installation that you cannot afford to lose. Not because the process is likely to destroy your Windows partition, but because partitioning operations are the one category of disk activity where mistakes can be expensive. Drive failures happen, installs occasionally go wrong in unpredictable ways, and there is no version of the advice that does not start with make sure your important files are somewhere safe. An external drive or cloud backup is the right call here before you touch anything. Now let us talk about secure boot, because this is a step that trips people up and the official CachyOS documentation is direct about it. Secure boot needs to be disabled in your UEFI firmware before you boot from the CachyOS installer. This is a setting in your BIOS or UEFI interface, typically found in a security or boot tab. On most modern systems, you access the UEFI by pressing a key during startup, commonly delete F2 or F12, depending on your motherboard manufacturer. Look for a secure boot setting and disable it before saving and exiting. Why does this need to happen? Secure boot is a mechanism that verifies the cryptographic signature of anything that boots on your system, specifically to prevent malicious bootloaders from loading before your operating system. Windows is signed by Microsoft and passes this check. Most Linux distributions, including CachyOS, are not signed in a way that Secure Boot will accept by default. The CachyOS documentation does note that Secure Boot can be configured after installation through a separate process. But for the installation itself to proceed cleanly, you need it off. The practical implication of running without Secure Boot is mostly relevant if you play competitive games that use kernel-level anti-cheat systems. Several major titles use anti-cheat that specifically checks for Secure Boot as part of its verification process. If those games are a central part of your PC gaming life, that is worth knowing up front. The list of games that have made their anti-cheat compatible with Linux through Proton has grown significantly over the past couple of years, but plenty of major competitive titles have not made that decision, and disabling Secure Boot does not help with that particular problem at all. Also, take note of BitLocker if you have it enabled on your Windows drive. BitLocker is Windows drive encryption system, and some Windows 11 installations have it turned on by default, particularly on OEM systems that came with Windows pre-installed. Disabling Secure Boot can, in some configurations, trigger BitLocker to ask you for your recovery key on the next Windows boot, because it detects that the boot environment changed. Before you disable Secure Boot, check whether BitLocker is active in Windows settings and make sure you have your recovery key saved somewhere accessible, either written down or saved to your Microsoft account. Creating the bootable USB drive is exactly what you have done if you have ever installed any operating system from USB. Download the CachyOS ISO from the official website. Use a tool like Rufus on Windows or Ventoy to write the ISO to your USB drive. Rufus is the simpler option for a single-purpose USB. Ventoy is better if you want to keep multiple ISOs on one drive, since you can just copy the ISO file into the Ventoy partition, and it will appear in the boot menu automatically. Both work fine with CachyOS. Once the USB is ready, restart your system and boot from it. Most systems let you access a one-time boot menu by pressing a key during startup, usually F11, F12, or Escape. Select your USB drive from that menu. You should not need to permanently change your boot order for this. If your system does not boot from the USB after you select it, double-check that legacy USB support in your UEFI is set to auto rather than disabled, which is a setting mentioned specifically in the CachyOS documentation. When the system boots from the USB, you will land in a live environment. This is a running version of CachyOS that operates entirely from the USB without touching your drive. You can explore it, test hardware compatibility, and verify that your network connection works before you commit to installing anything. Spending a few minutes here to confirm that your Wi-Fi adapter is detected and that basic display output is correct is worth the small time investment. Launch the installer from the welcome screen. This is the Calamares installer, the same graphical installation framework used by many mainstream Linux distributions, but CachyOS has customized it significantly for 2026. The first thing you will encounter that differs from most Linux installers is the bootloader selection screen. CachyOS now offers 4 bootloaders and gives you a description and visual preview of each one directly in the installer, which is a genuinely useful addition because most people installing Linux for the first time have no idea what a bootloader is, let alone which one they should pick. The 4 options are Limine, Grub, System-deboot, and Refind. Limine is the current default selection and the one the CachyOS team recommends for most people, and for good reason. It is a modern bootloader that handles Windows Dual Boot automatically through a tool called LiminScan, which detects the Windows EFI partition and adds it to the boot menu without you needing to do anything manual. It also integrates directly with BTRFS snapshot booting, which means if an update breaks something on your CachyOS installation, you can boot into a previous working snapshot right from the bootloader menu without needing to boot into a live USB and fix things manually. It supports both UEFI and BIOS systems. It is fast. For a dual boot scenario with Windows 11, Limine is the correct choice for the vast majority of people, and you should stick with the default unless you have a specific reason to do otherwise. Grub is the oldest of the 4 options, and the one that has the most documentation and community help available because it has been the dominant Linux bootloader for many years. It supports nearly every Linux file system, works on both BIOS and UEFI systems, and can do things like boot from encrypted partitions. The downsides in 2026 are that it is noticeably slower to load than the other options, and it has known compatibility issues with some MSI motherboards due to UEFI firmware that does not fully comply with the UEFI specification. If you are on an MSI board and considering Grub, be aware of that potential issue and consider Limine or System-deboot instead. System-deboot is extremely simple and extremely fast. It is part of the systemed family of tools that are already running on your Linux system, so there is no separate software to manage. The limitation for a dual boot scenario is that it does not automatically add an entry to UEFI NVRAM by default, which means you may need to do a manual step after installation using FIboot MGR to make the bootloader actually appear at startup. CachyOS pre-installs a tool called Limine Entry Tool that can handle this automatically, but it is one more thing to be aware of. For Windows Dual Boot, Limine does this more cleanly out of the box. Refind gives you the most polished graphical boot menu with automatic multi-boot detection on UEFI systems. It looks the nicest of the 4 options, and it is good at finding operating systems on the drive without being told explicitly where they are. The trade-off is that it does not measure TPM PCR values during boot, which is relevant if you care about the security implications of the boot chain. For most home users doing a straightforward gaming dual boot setup, this is not a meaningful concern, but it is worth knowing. After you pick your bootloader, the installer asks you about partitioning. This is the step where people most often make mistakes or get confused, so pay attention here. You have 3 main approaches for the partition setup. The first is to put both Windows and CachyOS on the same physical drive with separate partitions. The second is to install CachyOS on a completely separate physical drive from Windows. The third is to use the installer's automatic detection of your existing Windows install and let it place CachyOS in available free space. The CachyOS documentation is very direct about one thing. The install alongside and replace partition options in the installer are not 100% reliable and can cause the installation to fail. Manual partitioning is strongly preferred. This is not a comfortable thing to read if you are new to Linux, but it is honest guidance and following it will save you headaches. Manual partitioning sounds intimidating, but the actual steps are manageable. Before you booted into the CachyOS live environment, you needed to have already created free space on your target drive. If CachyOS is going onto the same drive as Windows, the way to do this is in Windows before you start the installation. Open Disk Management in Windows by pressing Windows key plus R, typing disk mgmt, MSC, and pressing Enter. Find your main Windows partition, right-click it, and select Shrink Volume. Specify how much space to give CachyOS. Remember the 30 GB minimum and the practical recommendation of 60 to 100 GB, and let Windows shrink the partition. This creates unallocated space that the CachyOS installer will then claim. In the manual partitioning screen of the Calamares installer, you will see your disk layout. The unallocated space you created will be visible. You need to create 2 partitions in that unallocated space. The first is a root partition, which is where CachyOS itself will live. Give this the majority of your available space. Format it as BTRFS, which is the recommended file system for CachyOS, because it integrates with the snapshot system and the Limine bootloader for the safety net functionality. Mount it at the path that shows as a single /, which represents the root of the Linux file system. The second is a swap partition, which acts as overflow memory when your RAM is fully used. A common recommendation is to make swap equal to the amount of RAM you have if you want hibernation to work, or somewhere between 4 and 8 GB if you just want basic overflow protection and are not planning to use hibernation. You do not need to create a separate EFI partition if Windows is already installed on the same drive, because Windows already created one when it was installed. The CachyOS installer and the Limine bootloader will use the existing Windows EFI partition to add the CachyOS boot entry alongside the Windows one. This is where the magic of Limine scan happens. After installation, Limine reads the EFI partition, finds the Windows boot manager files that Windows placed there, and automatically adds a Windows entry to the Limine boot menu. When you start your computer after installation, the Limine menu appears with both CachyOS and Windows listed, and you pick which one you want to boot that day. If you are installing CachyOS on a completely separate drive from Windows, the setup is in some ways cleaner and in some ways slightly more complicated. The benefit is that the two operating systems have zero overlap at the partition level, which means a Windows update cannot accidentally touch anything on the CachyOS drive. The downside is that you may need to manually configure the bootloader to find Windows on the other drive, or just use your UEFI's one-time boot menu each time you want to switch. Some people with two drive setups simply set the UEFI boot order to prefer one drive and switch manually when they want the other, which avoids any shared bootloader configuration entirely. This is not as smooth as a single boot menu, but it is extremely reliable. After partitioning, the installer moves to desktop environment selection. This is one of the things that makes CachyOS genuinely interesting compared to distributions that ship one desktop and call it done. You can choose from KDE Plasma, GNOME, XFCE, and several other options, including some more experimental desktop environments and tiling window managers for users who know what those are. KDE Plasma is the default and is the right choice for most people coming from Windows because its general layout, with a taskbar at the bottom, application menu, system tray, and window management behavior, maps closely enough to what you are used to that the transition does not feel like learning a completely foreign visual language. GNOME is the other major option and is extremely polished, but operates with a meaningfully different workflow that takes time to get comfortable with. One thing to be aware of is that the desktop environment you select is not on the ISO file itself. The installer downloads it during the installation process, which is why that active internet connection requirement is non-negotiable. The download size varies, but expect it to take meaningful time depending on your connection speed. This is not a step you can rush or do on a mobile hotspot without burning through data. After desktop environment selection, you set your locale, keyboard layout, time zone, and create your user account. These are standard steps that any operating system installer walks you through. Set a strong password for your user account. You will use this password every time you install software or make system-level changes. The installation itself, once you confirm everything and let it run, takes somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, depending primarily on your internet speed, since it is downloading packages while copying files. When it finishes and you reboot, remove the USB drive when prompted. The system should restart and present you with the Limine boot menu showing both CachyOS and Windows. If Windows does not appear in the Limine menu, the CachyOS documentation provides the manual fix. You need to locate the Windows EFI binaries on the EFI partition and copy them to the CachyOS EFI partition so the boot manager can recognize them. You do this from the CachyOS terminal using lsblk to identify your partitions, looking for the partition formatted as FAT32 or VF8 that does not have a Linux mount point, which will be the Windows EFI partition, and then following the copy commands in the documentation. This is the kind of thing that sounds complicated written out, but takes about 5 minutes if you follow the steps exactly. Once you are booted into CachyOS for the first time, a few things are worth doing immediately. The first is running a full system update through the package manager to make sure everything is current. CachyOS is a rolling release, and the ISO you installed from may be weeks or months old by the time you use it. The Shelly Package Manager, which replaced Octopi as the default graphical package manager in the April 2026 overhaul, handles this in a graphical interface if you prefer not to use the terminal. Alternatively, the terminal command to update everything is the same as on any Arch-based system. The second thing worth doing immediately is verifying that Steam launches and that Proton compatibility is enabled in Steam settings. Go into Steam settings, look for the compatibility section, and make sure the option to enable Steam Play for all titles is turned on. This is what allows you to run Windows-only games through Proton. The Proton CachyOS fork will be available as a compatibility tool option in your Steam library for individual games that you want to test it on, while the default Steam Proton handles the rest. The third thing, and this is specific to CachyOS and its BTRFS setup, is to familiarize yourself with how snapshots work. Because you installed on BTRFS and chose Limine as your bootloader, your system is automatically taking snapshots at certain points, and if an update ever breaks something, you can reboot. and select a previous snapshot directly from the limiting menu without needing any recovery USB or special preparation. This safety net is one of the genuinely compelling features of CachyOS compared to a distribution that does not have this built in, and it is a large part of why the rolling release model is less scary here than it might seem on paper. There's one ongoing reality of dual booting with Windows that you need to build into your expectations now, and the CachyOS documentation is honest about it, rather than pretending the issue does not exist. Windows updates can break the Linux bootloader. This does not happen every time, and some people go months or years without seeing it, but Windows updates sometimes overwrite the EFI partition in a way that removes or overrides the Linux bootloader entry. The result is that you restart after a Windows update, and instead of seeing the limiting menu, you see Windows booting directly. CachyOS is still on the drive and completely intact, but the pointer to it in the EFI partition got overwritten. The fix is straightforward once you know what happened. You boot from your CachyOS USB in the live environment, root into your installed system, and reinstall the bootloader. The process takes about 10 minutes if you know the steps, and the CachyOS wiki has the exact commands to follow. But it is disruptive, and it can be alarming if it happens, and you do not know why your Linux is not appearing. The cleanest way to avoid this entirely is to install CachyOS on a separate physical drive from Windows, because Windows updates only touch the Windows drive's EFI partition and cannot interfere with a completely separate drive that Linux controls entirely. If you have the hardware for two drives, that is genuinely the better long-term setup for dual booting, even if it requires buying a second SSD. The clock synchronization issue is another small but persistent thing to know about. Windows and Linux handle the hardware clock on your motherboard differently by default. Windows stores time in local time. Linux stores it in UTC. If you dual boot without addressing this, you will notice that your clock shows the wrong time in one of the operating systems after switching between them, because they are each interpreting the hardware clock value differently. The standard fix is to configure Linux to use local time instead of UTC for the hardware clock, which you can do from the terminal with a single command. Alternatively, you can configure Windows to use UTC, which is arguably the more correct approach, but requires a registry change. Either works, just pick one and apply it early before the mismatched clock behavior starts confusing you. The experience of actually using CachyOS for gaming, once everything is set up, is genuinely good. If your primary games run on Steam and either have native Linux versions or are on the Proton compatibility list, the day-to-day experience is smooth. You boot into CachyOS, open Steam, your library appears, games download, and they run. The performance for the games that work well is competitive with Windows and in some cases better, particularly in CPU-bound scenarios, where the compilation optimizations and scheduler improvements make a real difference in frame time consistency. The Proton layer has matured enormously over the past few years, and the compatibility list on ProtonDB, the community database that tracks which games work and how well, covers a huge percentage of the Steam catalog. The area where you will feel the friction most directly is anything that does not run through Steam. Game launchers from other storefronts require additional setup through tools like Lutris or Bottles, which are Linux gaming compatibility management tools with graphical interfaces. They work and the process is documented, but it is not as seamless as the Steam integration. If your gaming is primarily Steam-based, you will barely notice this. If you play a lot of titles from Epic Games, GOG, or Ubisoft Connect, expect to spend some time with Lutris learning how to configure each launcher. The kernel-level anti-cheat situation is the hard limit that no amount of Linux improvement has fully solved. Games that use Easy Anti-Cheat or BattleEye have a chance of working, because both of those anti-cheat systems have Linux-compatible versions that publishers can opt into, and a significant number have done so. But many competitive shooters use anti-cheat systems that specifically do not support Linux, and those games simply will not launch through Proton regardless of what you do. This is a publisher decision, not a technical limitation that CachyOS or Proton can route around. Before you make the dual boot jump, check the games you play most often on ProtonDB and confirm their status. For games you absolutely must play in their anti-cheat protected online mode and that are not supported, you will boot into Windows for those specific titles and use CachyOS for everything else. That segmentation is actually the strongest argument for dual booting rather than replacing Windows entirely. You keep full Windows capability for the cases where it is genuinely required, whether that is a specific game, a specific piece of software that has never had a Linux version, or simply the peace of mind of knowing Windows is still there. And you get CachyOS as your primary environment for the use cases where it works well, with the performance characteristics and the gaming stack that the CachyOS project has spent years optimizing. Over time, as you discover that more of your day-to-day computing works on the Linux side without friction, you may find yourself spending less and less time in Windows without ever having to make a dramatic, irreversible choice to abandon it. The entry cost for all of this is an afternoon of setup time, a USB drive, and willingness to follow the steps carefully at the partitioning stage. That is not nothing, but it is also not the daunting undertaking that dual booting had a reputation for being 5 years ago. The CachyOS installer in 2026 is good enough that the most technically demanding part of the process, which is the partitioning, is manageable with careful reading of the documentation. The Lemon bootloader handles Windows detection automatically in the common case. The system you end up with is a well-maintained, performance-optimized Linux install that runs alongside Windows without either one interfering with the other under normal circumstances. If you do run into issues during installation, the CachyOS forum and the documentation wiki are the right places to go. The documentation is specific and accurate. The community in the forum is generally helpful and knowledgeable. The most important thing the documentation says, and that bears repeating, is to reboot into the live ISO after any failed installation attempt before trying again, because the installer does not cleanly unmount partitions on a failed install, and leaving the system in that state causes continuous errors if you try to install again from the same session without rebooting first. Go back and check your partition situation if anything fails, verify your internet connection is active, and start from the live environment again. Most failed installs have straightforward causes and straightforward fixes. What you end up with is worth the effort. A machine that boots into Windows when you need Windows for the handful of things only Windows does, and boots into a fast, modern, gaming-optimized Linux system the rest of the time. That is a genuinely useful setup, and CachyOS is one of the best arguments for it in 2026.